Hello and welcome to a video where I have to start off with an apology because we are here on the last day of 2020 and I mean it's been a crazy year for everybody, for all concerned. I don't think we ever thought that it would be as it was perhaps in March, but back in March and through the early part of the year I did read a full a full length even version of my novel Walking on Cinders, which turned 10 years old this year. It was the 10th anniversary of that book. And then after that, I kind of also read this book, The Kraken's Curse, which was a novel that came out in 2008, my first novel. And so it's a little bit older than Walking on Cinders. But I now realise the glaring error in that I didn't actually finish it. The last 4 chapters of this book we didn't actually read. So apologies for that. I'm going to try and read it for you now, all 4 chapters in a kind of omnibus, I suppose, on the last day of 2020, starting off with chapter 26 and carrying on through chapter 30 of the novel. Chapter 26, How the Future Unfolds. The lazy light of the warm afternoon shone in through the gaps in the leaves. Beneath the tree, 2 people were deep in conversation. 2 people who had been through so much together, survived, prospered. It was quite a fight. Arthur smiled, running his fingers through the young girl's hair. You did really well. Well, yes, Megan smiled back. But you were the real star, weren't you? I think we both know who the real star was. Arthur had a strange look on his face, and Megan knew exactly what he was talking about. On the day of the fight, they had lost a dear friend, and now, as they both lay beneath the tree on such a calm day, everything seemed normal. Everything except for the fact that they would no longer hear Horace's voice, his witty comments or his profuse knowledge of life. In the end, his knowledge had led to their victory, but he had given the ultimate sacrifice in return. A memorial service had been organised for the following week, but at this particular moment, that seemed like a lifetime away. The pair were sitting in the orchard, just above the church where Megan's father, the Reverend James Tindersley, had once been the vicar, and where Megan and her mother now lived. It was quiet in the orchard and peaceful. This had always been Megan's favourite place, and Arthur just enjoyed the company of this amazing girl. The birds were singing in the trees, and the grass was a glorious green in colour. By now, the end of April had arrived, and spring had really set in. Your father would have been so proud of you, Arthur. He smiled, placing his arm around Megan's waist and cuddled her. Even your mother, Megan, was proud. Now, if you don't mind me saying, that is definitely a result. Megan giggled, kissing him lightly on the cheek. You're so kind, Arthur. I really feel safe with you, and I'm so relieved that my mother tends to agree with me. It was then that Arthur and Megan heard footsteps and a voice calling from the opposite end of the orchard. Arthur? The voice shouted with an excited tone. Arthur, I've got some great news. Arthur rushed forward at once and was greeted by Captain Jonathan McCrae at the gate. What is it? What is it? I think you know well what it is, Captain Jonathan McCrae smiled. Your father has made a full recovery and wishes to talk to you at once. Nothing could have prepared Arthur for this moment. Everything in the world seemed to stop for just a few seconds. It was bliss, and it seemed as though it just might last forever. Captain McCrae was a swift walker, and it didn't take them long to reach his cottage on the front of the marina, although even Arthur had to admit he was jogging to keep up. The captain seemed much brighter and breezier nowadays, and it was evident in everything that he did. The marina was far more pleasant than usual. The dapple green leaves of the trees whispered in the light breeze, and the rainbow-coloured flowers licked the captain's doorstep, wrapping themselves around the empty milk bottles. You could hear the rustle of the waves from the nearby seashore, and in the distance the faint calling of a seagull in flight. The captain pushed open the aging wooden door and wiped his sea boots on the mat. He hung his dark green mackintosh on the coat stand and led Arthur into the sitting room. It was hard to make out anything in the dark room itself. Along one wall was a settee, and in the corner was an old black and white TV. It was obvious that the captain lived in the past. It was there, though, sitting against the wall and propped up against the patches of the settee, that Arthur saw his father. The first thing he noticed was that the man sitting there in front of him looked far healthier and cleaner than he had been just a few days previous on the beach at Poole Harbour. He was dressed in a green pinstripe suit, one of which Arthur himself would have been proud. His rough stubble had been shaven and his hair combed neatly to the side. As Arthur looked on, he saw the similarities and he realised how close they had been and what they had missed out on in the preceding years. He wasn't going to waste another single second. "Arthur?" George Boston croaked, for his voice was still not back to normal. Come here, son." Arthur made himself as comfy as he could on the old settee and wondered what he would say to his father after such a long time. "I've got so much to tell you," Arthur stuttered, a little surprised at his own nerves. "Silly stuff, the sort of stuff you wouldn't miss if I were not to tell you, but stuff that a father and son should just talk about." "It would be nice," George replied. I cannot say I haven't missed it." And he smiled. It was only slight, perhaps the hint of a smile, but Arthur knew it was a smile all the same. Both men sat in silence, but Arthur was thinking on the situation. There were two grown men here lost in the silence of the moment. It was not an awkward silence, as is often the case in many situations. This was a private silence, while the two men thought of what to say next. It was lonely, you know," George spoke after a short while. "A really lonely existence as a fox. You might be forgiven for thinking that it was quite nice, what with the romantic title of the Silver Fox, but it was far from that, son." "I understand what you went through," Arthur cooed, "and that's why I did all of this for you, and for me, so we could be together." "Well, I dare say that you did it for the good of everyone else as well," George smiled in return, "and perhaps just a little for the fame and fortune that it might bring." Those last words made Arthur think. It was true. The Kraken's final defeat at his hands would make news across the world, but he just hadn't thought that far ahead. Would he be famous? Would he receive awards from the kings and queens of the world, a medal for bravery perhaps? Well, he didn't like to think about it. In fact, it scared him, and he'd rather his father had never mentioned it again. "Perhaps," Arthur said half-heartedly, "but it's the little things that really count." "Yes," George replied immediately. "Tell me about the little things." And it was an hour or more before Arthur Boston finally emerged from a little cottage on the marina and bid goodbye to Captain McCrae. He spent far more time with his father, of course, chatting and talking, or catching up on so much lost time. It was nice to be able to talk without any worries, without the fear of a decision being made on every word. Arthur knew you could never talk to anyone the way that you can talk to your own father or your mother, and it was this that he had truly missed the most during his adventures and expeditions. He now had to consider the return to normality and the small things that he had missed in this time, such as working at St. James's Place in London and his friends back in the city. He would need to consider finding a new job here on the coast, or perhaps he could start his own business. There seemed to be a whole world of possibilities now to discover. During his time in the cottage, Arthur had also done some silent thinking of his own, thinking through his future, and even though he hated to admit it, thinking about the fame that might well befall him. He needed to plan ahead, get his life back on track, and find some kind of stability. Closing the little wooden gate and leaving the cottage behind him, Arthur headed back up the hill towards the church and that orchard. Megan was still out amongst the apple trees awaiting his return, and she had attached a hammock between two of the largest of the trees. The spring this year had been exceptionally mild, and so had fallen the perfect weather for pitching a hammock and lying with a glass of lemonade and a good book. This, as it happened, was exactly what Megan was doing now. Arthur made his approach as quietly as possible so that Megan wouldn't realise that he was near, and then, when he was close enough to smell the new spring grass, he ran the last few metres, outstretched his arms, and gave her a hug from behind. Well, she was so surprised that a glass of lemonade nearly spilled all over her. "You're back then," she giggled, turning her head to smile in his direction. "How's your father?" "Oh, he's great. Really great," Arthur smiled back. "What have you been up to while I've been away?" Just reading my book and relaxing, you know, the usual." It was with that Megan and Arthur found something which he very rarely found in a person. Her smile was warm and welcoming, and they seemed to click like two people do only once in their lives. It was hard to believe that when they first met, she was working in a greengrocer's and he had been kicked out of home. It was hard to believe that when they first met, she was working in a greengrocer's and had been kicked out of home by her mother. There was one thing that Arthur wanted to do, though, and that was to visit home with him. Home on the cliff top, home that had once belonged to her father, the Reverend James Tindersley. Megan, there's something I want to ask you. Arthur put his hand out for support, and Megan immediately took it. But not here and not now. I need you to come back to my cottage on the cliff top, and I promise it will be really special. I don't know, Arthur, she whispered suddenly, more concerned. You know how I feel about that place. It's where my dad lived, after all. No, I know, sweetheart, but I want you to do this just once for me. Arthur looked Megan directly in the eyes and smiled. Her eyes were so beautiful. For you, I will do it, she replied without hesitation. I trust you with my life, and I know that you'll look after me. Oh, thank you, Megan. Tomorrow afternoon, I will be waiting for you. And so it was settled. Arthur and Megan were to meet on the cliff top the following afternoon, where he would lay out his plans for the future. The old winding streets that led to the top of the hill seemed a little bland and bare to Beatrice now. She used to love this area, the buildings, the countryside and the coastline. But now that she had lost someone who had been so important to her, it had lost its beauty and all of its splendour. The worst thing about it was that Horace never even knew the way that she had felt about him. He had taken the ultimate sacrifice in order to protect those that he loved, yet he didn't even realise. It was strange falling in love at her age, for she had married before and her husband had died many years back. Upon his untimely death, Beatrice had vowed to live alone as a widow and made a promise to herself that she would never fall in love again. But it had happened many years later, and despite the promises, she did not regret it. The only thing that Beatrice did regret, however, was not talking to Horace before it was all too late. Staring out of the kitchen window at nothing in particular, Beatrice poured a mug of tea for one, added sugar for one, and took a biscuit for one. Then she hobbled into the living room and sat down in her chair and thought. It was not fair that Horace had gone that way. Everyone knew that, but the truth was that it had happened, and now she had to grip reality and get used to it. There was nothing left to get on with. There was nothing left but to get on with life, although living on this particular coastline seemed to have no meaning to her anymore. And it was then that Beatrice made a decision. She had to get away. It was almost a split-second decision, but in that split second, she saw her future unfold before her. She knew it would not be a long future, for she was already old in her years, but it would be peaceful and pleasant, and she would have what remained of her family around her. In truth, Beatrice had always planned to move further north to be with her son, and she had very much hoped that Horace would accompany her. But now that she was alone once again, she felt as though she couldn't go without someone else beside her, and she had to make that move, regrettably, on her own. The worst thing about making such a big decision was that she had to tell her friends what had been decided. It was true she was not going to change her mind, but she had been putting the moment off somewhat, especially approaching Arthur. But today had been a particularly saddening day for Beatrice, and she could not take it any more. Well, she had to go and tell Arthur once and for all. And so she decided the following afternoon she would take her news and all of her courage with her and approach Arthur about her decision to move away. It would not be easy, and it would most definitely be an experience that Beatrice would not want to remember any time soon, but she had to do it. She just had to. It was late in the evening, and the shadows were drawing around the windows of the old cottage on the marina. Captain Jonathan McCrae and George Boston were sitting on the old sofa, deep in conversation. They had not noticed how dark it had become, and were no doubt discussing a matter of high importance, as was usually the case. "Do you not see what this means to me?" George Boston pondered, as he sipped from his mug of dark tea. "Yes, I do, George," Captain McCrae replied. "I never knew it was this complicated before. But now you have explained, I agree that you need to speak to Arthur as soon as possible." "Well, I'm glad you agree. I know it was not normal procedure to be gallivanting around so soon after recovery from such a serious illness, but these are not normal circumstances. George Boston had a strange glint in his eye that seemed to show that he knew something the captain did not, and even though he had explained himself in great detail, he had left one major point out. "I think tomorrow afternoon will be sufficient," George finished. "Yes, sufficient enough," Captain Jonathan McCrae agreed. So we move on to chapter 27 of 30. 27. Till death do us part. The following day happened to be bright and breezy. It was just the kind of day that Arthur had hoped for. With such beautiful weather, how could his plans for the afternoon possibly go wrong? During the morning, he had to venture into the small village of Studmore, and was surprised at what he found. As he walked along the dark stone streets, he saw villagers emerge from their houses and shopkeepers leave their counters right before his eyes. People began to stop him and speak to him, to ask him questions and call out his name. The strange behaviour of the locals meant that Arthur was made to tell his story over and over again. News of the battle against the Kraken, and more importantly, of Horace's death, had reached the village the day before, and now nobody could keep it from their lips. "How did you do it? Is it really dead?" one elderly man asked as Arthur passed. "You're so totally awesome!" a young girl screamed at almost the same time. It was only when Arthur reached the baker's, though, that he really found out what it all meant. "I hear you were with Horace just before he passed away," the baker said while preparing the loaf for Arthur. "He was one of my regular customers, a good man he was, and we never had a bad word for anyone." "Yes, you're right," Arthur mumbled, not really giving the baker a proper reply. "I used to come in here and give all the news, and I didn't really know it already, like, of course, but it was nice to hear it again from him." Arthur left before there was any chance of any further conversation. In fact, by the time the afternoon came around and Arthur began the long walk back towards his cottage on the cliff top, he wanted to forget what had happened that morning completely. There had been so many questions he didn't want to answer, questions that he didn't need to answer. It was a pleasant surprise then, and brought a smile back to Arthur's face when he arrived back at the cottage and found Megan waiting for him. She wore a sparkling blue dress with golden flowers and had let her hair fall down just below her shoulders. She looked amazing, and Arthur knew this afternoon would be very special indeed. Immediately, he paced up to Megan, took her hand and led her inside his humble cottage. "I'm not sure about this," Megan stuttered a little as they walked hand in hand towards the cottage door. "I'm still wary about entering my father's old cottage after all this time." "You'll be fine," Arthur whispered into her ear reassuringly. "Anyway, I'm not taking no for an answer." And with that, the small wooden door swung open and together they walked over the threshold. The first thing that Megan noticed was that the cottage was nothing like she remembered it. Her father had always kept things ordered, tidy and neat. Arthur, however, left the place a little cluttered, and although this was not the neatest of cottages she had ever seen, Megan couldn't help admitting that she still liked it. "It's really nice, isn't it?" she smiled, holding Arthur close. "Oh, thanks, Megan," he replied, with the same complimentary smile. "I'll just go upstairs and get changed, and then we can talk." It didn't take Arthur long to get ready, and when he made his way back down the oak stairs, he wore a dark pinstriped suit, and his hair was pushed neatly to one side. Megan looked at him and couldn't help giggling. "Why have you gone all posh on me?" she giggled, looking at what Arthur was wearing. "You will see," Arthur smiled broadly, taking Megan's hand and heading for the door. "I want you to follow me, and I want you to trust me." "All right," she replied, a little perplexed. A little while later, and both were standing on the edge of the cliff top and looking towards the horizon. "It's a beautiful view, isn't it?" Arthur said. "Yes, it really is. I can see why you spend so much time up here," Megan smiled. Arthur knew this was the moment he was waiting for. They were standing in one of the most beautiful locations on the coastline, and so far, everything had been perfect. It was time to take the situation into his own hands, and quickly he pulled a small black box from his pocket and concealed it in his right hand. Then he continued to address the beautiful lady who was standing before him. And as Arthur took the moment, he took it there and then. He took the moment for himself and for Megan, for his love and for the love he knew she had for him. Slowly, Arthur pulled himself down onto one knee, and Megan turned and looked him straight in the eye. She had a broad smile on her face, with just a hint of shock. I haven't known you for a long time, Megan, Arthur began, surprised at how much he himself was shaking. But I feel like I've known you all my life. I feel so safe around you, and I know I can never be sad when you are around. You have helped me through so many things. I know Megan tried to butt in, wanting ever so much to say how she felt about Arthur, but he reached up and placed a finger against her lips, stopping her in mid-flow. Well, this is my time now, Megan. You've done so much, and now I've got one thing to ask you. One thing that is hopefully going to make you ever so happy. Megan Tindersley, it would make me the happiest man in the world if you would do me the honour of being my wife. Megan didn't even need to think for half a second. Arthur had moved his finger, but he was still crouching in the grass. Yes, of course I will, Megan replied, almost screaming with happiness. Oh, this is so sweet! Such a surprise! Oh, I love you, Arthur Boston. And so she jumped at Arthur, almost knocking him backwards, and they were both lost in the moment, lost together forever. It was at that exact same moment that Arthur had proposed that Captain Jonathan McCrae and George Boston had reached the crumbling stone wall that marked the beginning of Arthur's land. I hope Arthur will be in this afternoon, George conversed with the captain as they paced across the field towards the cottage. It looked strangely deserted. It wasn't a bad guess, however, because when the pair arrived at the front door and knocked, they waited, but there was no reply. I wonder where he can be. I mean, Arthur is always around here somewhere. Here or the orchard, and we've already checked there. I believe he is around, Captain McCrae replied with a smile, looking just beyond the edge of the garden and towards the cliff edge. Out on the cliff, two figures were standing, legs dangling over the edge and giggling together. Out on the cliff, two figures were sitting, their legs dangling over the edge and giggling together. One of the voices was high-pitched and the other was low. It was the unmistakable voices of Arthur and Megan. Quickly, George Boston turned from where he was and paced over towards the couple with a wide smile on his face. Arthur, he boomed, almost causing his son to fall down the other side of the cliff. Father! Arthur turned, suddenly looking up straight to where George Boston stood. Arthur, I knew I'd find you somewhere around here. Oh, and Megan, what a nice surprise. What are you two doing up here on the cliff edge, then? Well, Father, Arthur broke in slowly, waiting for Captain McCrae to arrive at the scene. We've actually got some really good news to tell you. And Arthur gestured to Megan, who stood up his side and held him tightly. Father, Captain McCrae, Megan has agreed to become my wife. There was a little gasp from George and a massive grin appeared on the captain's face. Then they both spoke together. That is great news. I'm really pleased for you. Well, it's something that I've wanted for a long time now, and I know Megan wanted it too, Arthur smiled. When is the wedding planned for, then? Captain Jonathan McCrae asked the happy couple. Any time soon? Well, we've seen the posters for the remembrance service, and we were thinking a few weeks after that, Megan answered with a grin. Well, that sounds magical, George Boston spoke with a little less interest than the others. But Arthur, there's something I need to tell you. Arthur Boston shuffled a little uneasily and looked towards his father. What is it? He asked. It's important and you need to know. Things that I believe it's high time you learnt about, especially after all you've been through. It's your history. Arthur shifted his gaze away from his father's face and tightened his grip around Megan's waist. Can it not wait? I mean, so soon? He asked pleadingly. Yeah, you know, this is very important, Arthur, and I think we should meet tomorrow. The sooner it's done, the better. It would be better to get it out of the way, Megan piped up, turning and smiling in George's direction, perhaps trying to get into his good books. I suppose, Arthur grinned back. It was not that he didn't care for the history, or for the adventures that his father had been part of. It was more that it was too soon after his own. It always seemed to Arthur, throughout the quest to return his father, that he would need time to settle down and get everything back to normal. Instead, his father wanted to meet him and almost inevitably tell him long stories and then expect him to remember them. Arthur knew he would not have another chance, however, and after thinking it through quickly in his head, he accepted. Yes, all right. He looked towards Captain McCrae and saw him nod in acknowledgement. I knew you'd see the reasoning behind my madness, George Boston spoke gruffly. There is, however, one more thing I must tell you. You must meet me at a certain place, and you must promise not to tell anyone where that is, where you're meeting me. It's very important. Arthur's mind clicked. Perhaps this would be a little more exciting than he first thought. I promise, he replied. Taking a scroll which his father had just pulled from his back pocket, he knew it was the directions to the secretive location, and quickly he folded it once in half and tucked it away. Beatrice wasn't sure that her friends would accept her decision. She was sure that they would plead with her to stay, and she was right. It was late that same afternoon that the elderly lady finally opened up the gate and walked out onto the cliff top. Everyone was surprised to see her, especially Arthur, and he immediately told her the news of his proposed marriage. Beatrice was stunned, surprised and very happy. She promised that she would be at the wedding and then announced that she had some news of her own. It might not be as interesting as Arthur's news, but it's important, and I thought it was right for you to know. I'm sure anything you say will be important and have great meaning, Captain Jonathan McCrae smiled in Beatrice's direction. After all, you are a very important member of this community, and we've already lost one of those. Beatrice looked uncomfortable at the last remark. That's what I'm worried about, she winced a little uneasily. You see, I've made a decision. You've made a decision about what? The captain replied, confused. Well, I've been thinking long and hard, and I've realised that there's very little left for me around here anymore. That last sentence felt like poison in her mouth, and she knew exactly how her friends would take it. They would not be happy with her. They would not like her for the decision that she had made. Oh, you really think that? Captain McCrae asked warily, for he really didn't want to see Beatrice go. Well, it's been hard for me since Horace passed away, and my son left a long time ago, and now I'm all alone. I can see you feel lonely, and I understand that you're missing your son. I'm getting old, Beatrice continued, now a little more confident, and I'd like to live out my last few days with my family. Well, if you're sure it's the right decision, Arthur butted in, wanting to say how he felt and to say what everyone else was thinking. We'll support you all the way, but you must know we will miss you a great deal. And I will miss all of you as well. I've made some great friends, and I will never dream of losing contact with you, especially after what has happened. Beatrice finished and took a look around. On her left, George Boston was walking towards her, and he looked as though he wanted to address the whole group. Well, I'm sure you'll agree that there's been an awful lot of news today, George began, wanting to sum up everything that had happened. Arthur's announced he's going to get married. I've told Arthur there's something very important we must discuss, and now dear Beatrice has told us that she's going to be leaving us. Beatrice tried to smile, but found that she couldn't. I think the best thing we can do now is return to our homes and let it all sink in. I'm sure everyone could do with an early night, and by the time we get to where we are, the sun will have set anyway. Once everyone was out of the way, and the gate had clicked behind them, Megan turned to Arthur. She'd been hoping that they would be alone that afternoon, but she had not been angry when everyone else had turned up, because she knew that what they wanted to say was important. But now she was finally alone with Arthur. She couldn't help but turn him around, look deep into his eyes, kiss him, and hold him close to her. Okay, right. Chapter 28 of 30. We're making some progress here. And I hope you are enjoying this little omnibus of the last few chapters of the book that we didn't get to finish earlier on in the year. Chapter 28. The Divine One. Arthur approached the location tentatively. The sublime or the ridiculous could both take place here. The cove was so silent, the waves lapped at the shore but made hardly any noise, and the dry sand didn't even crunch underfoot. The location was ridiculous, yet the sheer beauty was sublime. Why would his father ask to meet him here, in a place so far from civilization? Perhaps it was all a trick, a test or a ploy just to see if his years of study in London had made any improvements. And it was at that moment that Arthur felt a complete fool. But it needn't have lasted for long, for the sheer beauty of the cove, contrasted with the dark wood behind, engulfed him. Arthur had only the strongest urge to sit and wait. Soon enough, time passed and his father made his way out of the undergrowth, the dead tree branches crackling and splintering beneath him. "Thank God," Arthur shouted absent-mindedly. "I thought you weren't coming, and I was certain I was going to look a complete fool." "Ah, but you have the tenacity to wait," his father replied with a smile. "Perhaps this place, I'm guessing, emitted a hold on you, just as it did for me many years ago." "It is a strange place," Arthur pondered, perching on a stone and looking up at his father. "It's so beautiful, yet strangely sinister at the same time." "This is magic, my son. If you look just beyond the horizon, I'm sure you'll be able to see a bay from where you fought the Kraken." Arthur squinted and looked out to where the sea met the sky. Sure enough, laid out before him, which he would never have thought to see possible, were the golden sands and dunes of Poole Harbour. "But how?" Arthur asked, perplexed. "Well, that is out on the horizon. Surely it cannot exist there. There's absolutely no way to get out there." "Ah, you see, that's all part of the magic." Arthur Boston couldn't understand why his father had brought him to the cove. Neither could he decipher why the location possessed ever so much magic. It was magic that he himself had not even noticed. Yet he knew it was there, and he had felt the strange pulling sensation that stopped you from leaving once you had arrived. George Boston took a seat next to his son and reached into his backpack. From inside he pulled out a majestic book with a cover of gold and red. The book looked very old and almost priceless. It was obviously a great family heirloom and held many secrets within it. Opening the cover and peering at the first page, George Boston began. "I feel that now is the right time for you to discover certain secrets." He paused before the word secrets and then spoke in an emphasized manner. "There are lots of secrets in the world that no education, no school or university can teach you." "I always thought that I was challenged by the course I tried to study in London," Arthur replied with a smile. Perhaps this was the one chance to slightly alter his future and let his father know that his time in London had been a complete disaster. "Exactly, and I feel this book will give you all the answers that you might have longed for without even knowing that you needed them." "I'd like to think that I think I'd like to read that book," Arthur replied, as if it was exactly what his father wanted to hear. "Ah, well, that's the thing, you see. I'll have to tell you and use the book for references. There are certain restrictions. I've no doubt that you will become accustomed to these in due course. Shall we begin?" "Yes." And with that, Arthur Boston listened avidly as his father began to tell the story of his past, his present, and his future, all entwined around the mysterious red and gold book in his hand. Our story starts many years ago with a young man called Alexander Boston. He lived in a manor house on the outskirts of a normal town in the royal county of Wessex. Unfortunately, at the time, there was much uprising amongst the peasants, and Alexander seemed to be the cause, or so the people thought. The king had ordered that land should be taken from the villagers and used to graze the royal flock instead. This meant that any tenants who unfortunately lived upon this land had to leave their homes, and then the homes had to be destroyed. Of course, any normal person would believe this to be a great injustice for the people. Everyone, that is, except for Alexander. For he was from royal blood, and although still young, was the lord of his own manor, and had many hundreds of servants waiting at his beck and call. Alexander Boston was descended from the third previous king of England, but he was not a direct descendant, and so was not in line for the throne. This had always annoyed him very much, and his anger usually surfaced during arguments with the peasants. Alexander had chosen the royal county of Wessex to set up home because he knew that it would show everyone he was of royal blood and not to be messed with. On the whole, Alexander Boston was not a very nice person, but it didn't take long for that to change. One night in the late summer, Alexander decided to eat a light dinner and take an early night. He had been up early the next morning to welcome a visit from none other than the commander of the royal armies himself, who was looking for new recruits to fight in battles in Europe. As Alexander lay in his bed high above the city and tried to sleep, his thoughts began to stray to the peasants in the streets below. This was very uncommon for someone like Alexander, for he would always try to disassociate himself as far as possible from anyone who might affect his reputation. After what seemed like several hours of nothing but thought, he decided that he just wouldn't be able to sleep that night and should instead just lie here and wait for the morning. It was then that something very strange occurred. The window of the bedchamber, which had been left open by the maid due to the warm weather, began to shake violently. Winds began to blow around the opening, where before there had been no movement whatsoever. Then from a dark corner of the night, a ghostly figure stepped into the bedchamber and stood at full height. "Alexander Boston," the figure spoke in a long and wiry rasp, "you have done many things of which you should be ashamed, and I am here to change your ways." By this time, Alexander was huddled up against the corner bedpost in complete fear. I do not know of what you speak," he stuttered. "I think you do. You have not stood up for the local people who have treated you so kindly, Alexander Boston. You may be descended from royal blood, but that does not give you the right to disgrace those who have been so kind to you." I am sorry," was all that Alexander could think to say, although even that was half-hearted. "You are lucky, Alexander, that I am not here to trial you. I am here, in fact, to bring you great news. I will bring you the great acclaim with which you so long have to become accustomed, and in the future perhaps even great wealth." Alexander Boston's ears pricked up at the moment the ghostly figure spoke, and he immediately moved closer to the bed edge, and almost to ask the figure now standing in the doorway a question. "Figure, what is this you speak of?" he asked. "Oh, let me explain," the figure smiled strangely. "You may find this hard to believe, Alexander, so listen very carefully. For many years now I have been searching for something important. This has taken up many years of my time. I passed from this life 50 years ago, this very evening, and I have been carrying on with my work ever since. I believe I have come here this evening for a very good reason. 3 years before my death, I discovered some old notes bound together in a chamber below this house I was renting from the monarchy, and I, like many of the people sleeping right outside this very building, had been thrown out of my house with immediate effect. While gathering the last of my belongings, I had found the notes in an old diary and read through them many times. It surprised me greatly to read of a race of people who called themselves the Divine Ones. From the rough notes I had discovered, I worked out that these people were not so much a race, but a long descended chain of singular humans who seemed to have great magical powers and greater than average strengths. But unfortunately for me, I had only one page of the diary, and the other appeared to have been ripped from their binding. Perhaps this was to deter me from discovering the real secret, and I do not know. And the problem I now face is that I am growing weak. As a spirit, I will soon be drained of power, and I will no longer be able to leave my cell." "But I don't see what this has got to do with me," Alexander Boston replied, confused, once the spirit had finished. "Well, scrawled along the top of one of the pages that was in my possession was the name of an ancient being. I had only heard of such a creature in the legends, of course, and I'm not willing to divulge such a name in the presence of this company. I can, however, say without a doubt that I've tracked you down tonight because you are the only current descendant, and so by my reckoning that means you are the current holder of the divine line." Alexander Boston was completely shocked that the spirit standing in front of him had come to such a conclusion. Yet at the same time he couldn't disagree that he would gain from this. His immense wealth and power would come, and he craved that. "I think you know that this can change your life," the spirit replied, taking in the expression on Alexander's face and smiling that ghostly smile once again. "I think it would be wise for you to have the diary and to continue my work. It is, of course, your own choice as to whether to carry on or not, but it would be a shame to waste over 50 years of work. George Boston paused where he was and looked up at his son's face. The look he saw there was hardly surprising. Arthur was confused, shocked and happy all at the same time. And I'm afraid that's where the story ends, he said rather bluntly. At least from this book, however. Do you know any more? Arthur found himself asking without any hesitation. I knew you were going to ask me that, and the answer is yes, I do. You do? Arthur smiled. Yes, I do, George Boston ended bluntly. Once again, before carrying on, it was as if every word he said was making a detailed point. The first thing I know is that Alexander Boston did take that spirit's advice, and he continued to work in his legacy. Soon after that meeting, he went about setting up a trust in which to keep all the work that the spirit had completed. Alexander, being wealthy and of great power, had the ability to do this rather easily, and in doing so, made sure that this powerful discovery would be kept for future generations. So, Alexander believed the spirit? Arthur asked his father. Yes, I believe so. I don't know why he did so. In fact, I cannot even hazard a guess at his reasons, but he did. The only conclusion that I can come to is that Alexander Boston wanted the power and the wealth that such a discovery would bring. I believe he also knew that he himself was a little unusual in person and just wanted an explanation for the numerous strange occurrences that he had witnessed in his own life. But how do you know all of this is real? Well, for a start, ever since that night, every descendant that followed always took pride in the fact that they were descended from the great Alexander Boston, as he became known. He was to be known as this more towards the end of his life, once he had passed his powers on and used his wealth to set up many schools and academies. There is, of course, still one problem. Arthur looked puzzled. This was all too much to take in, yet he couldn't resist asking one more time. What is that, then? Well, his father replied, as of yet, nobody knows who the spirit actually was. On that night, Alexander met the spirit. It had mentioned that it had passed from this life 50 years previous. Although there have been various excursions and investigations into the whereabouts of any sort of grave for this figure, none has yet been found. Could it not be that Alexander was just making this all up for his own gain? Arthur was really getting into this now. Well, he could have done, yes, but there is far more truth and evidence to prove that the divine line does exist. It could be that Alexander Boston was not the first trace of a line, that the story could have been lost over the years. Arthur, many of the great battles down the years have come from people leading with a divine bloodline in them. They may not have known it at the time, but it was there, and it has been passed down through them over the generations. Oliver Cromwell during the Civil War almost certainly had the divine bloodline. William Shakespeare gave the line to his character Richard III, most probably because he carried it himself. Queen Victoria is the longest reigning monarch in history. Why? It is because she has divine links in her lineage. Well, even recent heroes such as Winston Churchill have battled to save our country and have used the divine line as their main strength. And what do all of these people have in common? Their names live on, because they did something that was for the benefit of others. They put themselves in the firing line to protect the ones that they cared about. The one thing that tears us apart from a divine line from anyone else is the brave, courageous and dependent nature of that person. It's a willingness to fight for those they love, a willingness to protect all those around them, and the quality of a great leader. Arthur had never realised before now that he possessed all of these qualities himself. His family name was the same as that of the great Alexander, but it was too much of a coincidence, surely. He couldn't be descended from the great man and have a bloodline in him that had been passed down through all these famous people, could he? Are you trying to tell me that we are descendants from the great Alexander Boston? Arthur asked his father a little sheepishly. Well, I'd let you come to that decision for yourself. Would the Kraken have risked turning me into a silver fox if I didn't have something of the great interest into him? Would you have been able to fight your friends and family and look death in the face? The Kraken wanted you dead because you were the next descendant. If you had been killed, he would have given me no chance. If you had been killed, he would have given me no choice but to pass my powers over to him, so that he could rule both the lands and the sea. But I thought you said the divine line was only passed down through descendants and families, Arthur asked again, for there were so many questions. Ah, his father pondered. Well, that's not strictly true. You see, over the centuries, the line has been somewhat distorted. That's another part of the magic. If the current holder of the line performs some great feat of great magic and power, then they have to pass on the line to someone else. If they do not have an heir, then the line can be passed on to anyone who the current holder thinks is worthy. At the moment, Arthur, the line has returned to its true descendants, that's you and me. But for a long time it was in the hands of other people. People who wanted to disrupt and use the line for evil purposes. Can you tell me about that? And what about you? Are you the current holder of the line, or am I? Arthur asked. He knew he was asking too many questions, but he wanted the answers. He was so very interested now. Firstly, I do not know a lot about it, and I'm sure in time you'll discover it for yourself. Secondly, we have arrived at a problem. It would have been best for me to have passed the line on to you when I first fought Atkinson on the hilltop, but because our spells fused together and I was turned into a silver fox, the line froze. Had I survived, or even been killed in that battle, then the line would have passed on to you. But it didn't, because it was frozen in the form of a silver fox, as was I. Of course, nobody can doubt that you completed an act of deep bravery, and I suspect that even though the line was frozen, a little bit of that escaped into you when you were born, and it helped you to achieve what you did. Your dear mother always knew that you were a special child. So I won't actually receive the line myself? Arthur asked, hoping this was the final question. No, George Boston smiled. I think you've gone through plenty enough without the burden of this on your shoulders. In any case, I know someone who would make a very good future carrier of a divine bloodline. Yes, I think I know who you mean. Well then, I know there's an awful lot for you to digest right now, son, but I remember rightly, if I remember rightly, we have a wedding to be preparing for. Yes, Arthur answered, as he looked out towards the horizon once again. As he looked, he noticed that the scene had changed. Paul Harbour had disappeared. Instead, there were masses and masses of clouds, and behind the clouds stood two shrouded figures. One had dark-coloured skin and the other long hair. They seemed to be arguing. Arthur suddenly realised who these two men were, Atkinson and Alexander Boston. Perhaps it was a ritual after death to meet with the great master of the divine line. Arthur really didn't know. But as he turned and headed for the crackling branches of the forest behind him, he couldn't suppress his grin. Walking back up towards the village and his cottage on the cliff top, Arthur was deep in thought. After he had battled the Kraken, he had thought that everything was finished, that it would all go back to normal. But yet today he had been surprised once again. This time with stories of his past and his heritage. They were things he never even dreamt of being told. It seemed strange to imagine himself as being descended from such important and powerful people, especially when, in a few days' time, he would say goodbye to a much-loved friend and then settle down with his fiancée to lead a somewhat normal life. So here we are at chapter 29 and then chapter 30 of this final couple of chapters of the novel The Kraken's Curse. Chapter 29, The Line Passes On. George Boston knew exactly who would be his successor. The fact had been obvious. He had known it all along, right from the very first day they had met. George Boston had met Jonathan McCrae when he first moved to the coast. Jonathan was a little older than him, but he was the only one who seemed to welcome him and look out for him. At school they had got on like a house on fire, and had always been the first to volunteer for anything even slightly dangerous. They both loved adventure, and had regularly been camping together, taking in the sights and the scenery. They had been the best of friends. This was until that fateful night. George had made a promise to himself. He knew about the divine line, really needed to plan for the future. Captain Jonathan McCrae, by which he was now known, was the only choice. But that evening, while under the powers of the Kraken, Captain Jonathan McCrae had killed a man. Of course, George Boston didn't know that he was being controlled by some evil sea creature, and he had instigated a massive argument with his friend. It ended with George Boston disowning the captain, but there was no chance for change, Soon enough, George would be turned into a silver fox and locked in a magical world. He couldn't help thinking that he had made a mistake. Now that everything had come to light, and now that his son had killed the Kraken once and for all, he couldn't forgive himself for the arguments that he had caused. There was only one way out. Arthur already had a good idea of who his father wanted to pass the line on to, so why not go ahead with it? It was at the bottom of the orchard that George and Captain Jonathan McCrae decided to meet the following day. Nobody except George and Arthur knew how important this meeting was, and even the aging sea captain couldn't prepare himself for what was about to take place. Soon enough, Jonathan McCrae arrived. He was dressed in full naval uniform, and he'd been told it was something of a great stature and importance. George Boston could feel the butterflies in his stomach as he watched Captain McCrae pace down towards the bottom of the orchard. "Good afternoon, George. A lovely day, isn't it?" the captain shouted. "Yes, it is just," George replied, although he had a strange feeling that the joyfulness of the day would not keep. "You know why you're here, then?" George continued, a little wary that he may have to skip around the facts. "Yes, of course I do," Captain McCrae replied. "I'm here to receive a great honour that you'll pass on to me." It was a relief to George Boston that Captain McCrae had taken this the way that he had hoped. George knew that this was most likely only because he was a dear and old friend. To discover that your closest friend carries some strange and magical bloodline is a shock to anyone, and George was not sure how the captain would take it. The previous day, he had been set on by his son, Arthur. He was going to the captain's cottage to reveal the story of Alexander Boston and the great divine line that he himself had only just come to terms with. It was strange and a little unusual. The captain had listened intently as the story was told and smiled at the correct points. He was a little perplexed when it came to the divine line, but once Arthur had finished, there were only a very few questions. "So your father carries this great line, then? And you should have had it when you defeated the Kraken, but you did it anyway and without it, and your father wants to pass it on to me," he had said after all that. He had said all in one breath. "Yes," Arthur had replied simply, for there was no real other answer. As well as all the relevant books and notes that were passed down from the divine carrier to the divine carrier, it was agreed that the captain would take hold of all the notes and research that Horace had worked on during his lifetime. This was an excessive amount, but Jonathan McCrae, being a man of simple tone and pleasant word, accepted them with grace and looked for somewhere to store them. One of the main reasons why he had taken these on was not because he was interested in the secrets they held, but because of the circumstances that his dear friend had died in, and the fact that he had believed they should form part of the artefacts that were passed down in memory of Horace. And so this is how George Boston and Captain Jonathan McCrae had come to stand at the bottom of the orchard on this particular morning. They both knew what must happen, and they were both aware it must take place, but still, you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. "Right then, to business," George Boston spoke. "Of course," Captain McCrae replied simply. It was as if he was already embracing what was to come, and this annoyed George a great deal, although he couldn't put his finger on precisely why. The transfer of the divine bloodline to another carrier is in fact a fairly simple one. The instructions are kept in the back of a diary that handily never seemed to run out of pages. This was the diary in which they had discovered the Kraken's curse. Who wrote these instructions down is not known, although it's widely believed to be the spirit which visited Alexander Boston. By today's standards, the instructions would be barely decipherable, as the papers were so old. It was good then that every carrier seemed to have this knowledge within them. George Boston stood close to the captain and held his right hand outstretched. Jonathan McCrae took it with his left. They were now equally matched by different sides of the body. George Boston now had to recite a special piece of prose, an oath needed to be agreed by the potential new carrier. "I, George Boston," he began, keeping direct eye contact as he spoke, "have been privileged to carry the divine bloodline now for nearly 30 years. I have completed my piece of the ever-growing puzzle that we now know as life, and I have taken charge and completed a task of great proportions. I lived in the name of the great Alexander Boston, and I will now die in the name of the great Alexander Boston. I feel that now is the time to pass on my powers." Something moved in the space between the interlocking hands. It was only a tiny thing. Blink and you would miss it, and to find it would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, but it was there. It was the tiniest bubble of blue sparks, and it was growing into a bright light by the second. Quickly and with great power, the light shot out from the space between George and Jonathan's hands. It jumped, sparked in the air, and flashed around behind their heads before returning to the centre, right between the two men's gaze. The colour was changing now, getting deeper, darker, and within the light something was beginning to appear. It was taking the shape of a man. It was a man with a short, straggly beard, who appeared to be of extreme old age. He addressed both men with a creaky, decrepit voice. The man was all that remained of the great Alexander Boston. "George Boston, how nice it is to meet you at last," the man began, as the image flickered. "I see that you have passed the line once more back to its rightful family." "Yes, it has," was all George could think to say. "I note that this time around there have been many problems with the passing of the line. You were intending to pass it on to your son, Arthur. Is that right?" "Yes, it is," George replied. He always thought simple answers were best. "Well, then I understand your reasoning. By rescuing you from your captive seat and by destroying the beast which plagues us all, he in turn completed his task without even carrying the line. I'd like your son to know that it was quite a show. I was watching with envy, you know." "Were you now?" George smiled at the old man before him. He was warm and somehow comforting, as if he had been through a lot and had emerged stronger. "I should tell Arthur that. I'm sure he will be both interested and surprised. No doubt he also managed to wipe another creature off my demon list. 2 down and 5 more to go, but enough about that now. We have work to be done." Captain McCrae shuffled uneasily on the spot as the old man turned to look at him. The oath of courage, I believe." Yes, the captain replied sheepishly. "Repeat after me," the old man smiled, for he had done this 1,000 times. "I, Captain Jonathan McCrae. I, Captain Jonathan McCrae, do hereby pledge on the oath of courage. Do hereby pledge on the oath of courage to honour and obey my people. To honour and obey my people. That in times of trial will suffer for their fate. That in times of trial will suffer for their fate. Amen." Captain McCrae paused for a second and then, "Amen," he repeated. As suddenly as he had once appeared, the blue figure of Alexander Boston was gone without a second thought. He didn't even take time to say goodbye. Once again, the blue light fizzed and whirred more ferociously than before, and then it sped around the outside of the two men, encasing them in a misty blue glow. Immediately, George Boston dropped his hold on Jonathan McCrae's hand. The blue light zipped up to the sky, and then with a tremendous, heartwarming buzz, faded into the light of the afternoon. It was over. The divine bloodline had been transferred. Neither of the men now standing in the orchard felt any different, nor did they think that anyone would be able to tell them apart. It would be only a matter to themselves and those who knew. To others, it would be completely implausible. George and Jonathan parted ways soon after and contemplated their separate fates. For George, it meant a life of relative normality and peace for the rest of his days. For Jonathan, however, his adventures had only just begun, and although he was older than George and much less agile, he had to live with the fact that there would be at least one more adventure left in him. It was one more adventure in which he would have to be the hero, and in which many more lives would have to be saved. Where and when this would happen, he did not know, but what he did know was that it would happen at some point in the future, and this time, he would be the star of the show. Okay, we're carrying on here, and we're going to now do the very final chapter of the book. This is chapter 30. It ends as it begun. It ends as it began. The light broke in through the dappled green of the trees and reflected off the blades of grass. Everywhere was silent. Everywhere was still. The whole village had turned out for this memorial service, and the whole area was quiet because of it. All of the streets were empty, and not a dog barked. Everyone had gathered in the field just above the church to pay their respects. The sun was lazy in the late afternoon sky, and the land was growing restless and tired. The evening air was beginning its descent, whispering around the bramble bushes and whistling through the fur on the rabbits, causing them to retreat to their burrows in earnest. The world was in mourning. The enemy had been defeated, and now was the time for rest. As happens sometimes, a moment fell and remained for much more than a moment. Gradually, some time awoke again, and the memorial service began. People stood in several large groups, and the turnout was amazing, considering the size of the villages. Standing at one side were the villagers of Copse and Studmore, and facing them on the opposite side were the heroes who had travelled the arduous journey. At the front stood the various Tindersley family members. There was the mother, hand in hand with the daughter, all past hatred forgotten. Several people let a tear form in their eye as the vicar read the stunning memorandum written by Captain Jonathan McCrae. It was strange to think that the wrongs that had been righted and the coastline was now free after so many years. Following the memorial service, everyone made their way to the small church on the hilltop and took their places for the funeral. People were spilling out of the door when the back of the stagecoach drew up alongside the avenue of trees and the first hymn began. Horace would have been proud of the way that he was laid to rest and the way that everyone had turned out to pay their respects. There was a speech by Arthur himself to tell how brave Horace had been, and a last respects paid by George Boston, who had known this pillar of the community for such a long time. It was all such a respectful affair, and when it was over, the congregation was led out to the orchard to a very familiar tune, one that Horace would have been proud of. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. Walking steadily, Arthur made his way across the sand dunes and down onto the deserted beach. He had half expected Captain Jonathan McCrae to be waiting for him, with his pipe in his mouth. But the captain was nowhere to be seen. He was back in the village with everyone else. It felt strange to Arthur, returning to where everything had begun. This was the place where he had first met the sea captain more than a year ago. That chance meeting had changed everything, had led to the discovery of so many things and so many tragic consequences. Now that Horace was gone, it felt to Arthur like he had lost a piece of himself. Of course, he was happy to have had his life back the way that it should be, his father at his side and his friends nearby, but it all seemed just a little bit ordinary. He longed for the next stage in his adventure, the stage that he knew now wouldn't come, for Horace was dead, and that was the end of it. Arthur's father no longer carried the divine bloodline that now rested upon Jonathan McCrae's shoulders, but for how long he didn't know. There was one thing for sure, though. If he had known all that time ago that Captain McCrae was to carry the line after his father, he wouldn't have given it all up to him then and there for anything. He would not have missed the adventures, the happiness, and the heartache for all the wealth in the world. A few days after the memorial service, Arthur happened to be walking towards the village green on a surprisingly sunny morning, considering the time of year, when he passed by a familiar building. The outside of Paul McCrae's pub had changed drastically. Where there were only dark greys and blacks, the whole of the front of the facade had now been repainted in a bright blue, a colour that complemented the sky above. It was such a pleasing scene that Arthur felt compelled to step inside. After all, he had not spoken to Paul since his hideous run-in with him, and it would be advantageous to clear the air. Inside, the decor had improved greatly. The whole room had been replastered and wallpapered, making it feel far more welcoming, and all the broken tables had been repaired with new wood that had been varnished. What surprised Arthur the most, though, and made him smile all the more, was the amount of customers he would see sitting at various tables around the bar. Arthur had barely opened his mouth to speak when Paul McCrae got there first. "Arthur!" he boomed warmly from behind the bar. "What a nice surprise! Please, stay and have a drink. On the house, of course." Arthur took up the request with good grace and pulled a stool close to the bar. "I'm very glad that things have been finally laid to rest," Paul continued, as he poured Arthur a drink. "My brother seems an awful lot happier, and your father seems to be adapting well." "Well, it has been a long and hard journey, but we made it through, and I have to say that you are more forgiven for your past actions. I said some things before that I know I shouldn't have said, but it gave me the information that I needed, and it helped me to finally solve the mystery." Paul McCrae smiled and absent-mindedly looked around at the others who were sitting to his left. "It's nice to hear that, Arthur, but if anything, it should be me that's thanking you. What happened that day made me realise that I was not the person I wanted to be, and it caused me to make all of these changes. Changes for the better. Arthur couldn't quite believe the transformation he was witnessing in the man standing before him. Paul had mellowed out, and he seemed so much happier. And so the conversation continued for almost an hour before Arthur finally suggested that Paul visit his father sometime soon, and then he continued on his way. It was on the following Tuesday that Arthur felt he had to visit Jonathan McCrae and tell him of what he feared might happen in the future. He walked down the hill, past the old pub that was now owned by the sea captain's brother. The walk seemed surprisingly quick this time around, and when he reached the front door he discovered that his father was waiting for him. "Ah, Arthur," he beamed, in a way that Arthur was finally beginning to get used to. "You're on your way to see Jonathan, I'm guessing? Well, then that's good, because I need to talk to him also, and I have an inclination that you'll both be discussing the same thing. Funny that, isn't it?" The door opened with a click, and a beaming captain, a much happier man, stood before them. "Ah, Arthur and George," he smiled. "Come on in, I've been expecting you." Arthur really couldn't think why. "I know you're here to talk about the future," he said as they sat down in the sitting room. He was a little more serious this time. "I believe you and me, I know exactly what I'm in for, even at my old age." "Well, I'm sure you've been reading up on Horace's notes and getting to know the diary that I gave you," George pondered. "Of course, and I must say it's all very interesting," the captain replied. "There's an awful lot to answer and discover, an awful lot of knowledge to take in." "Well, you must feel greatly privileged then," Arthur butted in, taking the conversation away from his father's grasp. "Yes, I do, Arthur. It's like a great weight lifted off my shoulders." "Well," Arthur began, his voice taking on a completely different tone, "you must be aware of what will happen. When the time arrives to take hold of a situation and for you to be thrust into the limelight, it will feel strange. It will be unreal and you won't like it. I should know. Look at what I've been through with you and the others. You won't like the way you feel. You'll wish that it could all just be over and that you could be normal again. You will almost be completely selfish, but I'm sure you'll be able to work through it. Just don't do what I did and keep it all inside you." Captain Jonathan McCrae couldn't help but smile. He knew this was coming. Perhaps when the line had transferred, he had been filled with some magical power that allowed him to tell what would happen in the near future. He didn't know, but all the same, he thanked Arthur for his wisdom. "Thank you, Arthur, but I'm a grown man and I'm sure when the time comes I'll be able to work through it." "You will still be taken under. It's like a spell. You cannot stop it," Arthur spitted, for a second returning to his former self, his personality before he had arrived on the coastline. Arthur Boston turned to leave. There were obviously far more important things that his father had to discuss with the captain. He was no longer needed. But as he took a few steps forward, he noticed Captain McCrae smile. Turning to see what all the fuss was about, Arthur realised Jonathan had one more thing to say to him. "Arthur, I meant to ask earlier," the captain smiled. "But is there going to be any reward for solving the mystery of your person? You sent me that riddle on the first day that we met, and I'm pretty sure that I've now solved it. Don't you think?" Arthur couldn't help but smile. He didn't much want to respond to that question, and so quietly he made his excuses and headed for the front door in the hill beyond. Arthur Boston was now satisfied that he had told his friend Captain Jonathan McCrae everything. There was nothing left in him now, and he could live a normal life. Everything seemed perfect, and the one thing that he was sure of was that whatever his father was discussing with the captain back in the cottage, it made no difference to him whatsoever. Now his life had been changed by the divine line, and yes, he would not be the same again, but he liked the way that things were now, and he was content. Over the coming weeks, Arthur Boston gave up much of his time to thought. Of course, he was always kept busy, firstly with moving Megan's belongings up to his cottage on the cliff edge, and secondly with the wedding. But as he went about his business, he still had time to think. One of his favourite pastimes took place in the evening, when the sunrise of the day meant that the darkness of the incoming night, and he could just sit and wonder. He would sit on the cliff edge, which he had done such a long time before, while thinking about Captain Jonathan McCrae, and he would ponder. It was on one particular night that he was overcome with emotion. He thought about Horace. Was he looking down on them and smiling? Was he shaking his head at any of the mistakes that they made? He also thought about Beatrice. By now she would be happily at her son's side, looking for a new house and a final place to call home. He hoped she would return for the wedding, and he hoped that it could take place here on the coast, but this was where it had all happened. Things he would never have forgotten. He never wanted to forget. Gradually the sun began to set behind the edge of the horizon, and the evening sky was filled with dark reds and purples. Sitting on the edge of the cliff top and looking out to sea was very peaceful, especially if you had been through as much as Arthur Boston. Concentrating on the point where the misty blue sea met with the dark sky was calming, and it almost dragged you in so that you felt it was wrong to leave. But all things have to come to an end at some point, and Arthur Boston knew that tonight's period of horizon gazing was over. Half-heartedly, he gathered his belongings. Placing them back into his satchel, he hauled himself up from the edge of the cliff and the path to the cottage that snaked out behind him. He carried on up to the warm bed, to his home-cooked meal from his fiancée Megan, back up to reality and the life that he leaded now. Back up to reality and the life that he led now, as it should be. Slowly, all the colours of the landscape began to merge into one. Slowly, all the colours of the landscape began to merge into one, and as Arthur Boston disappeared behind the tall grasses, the dark night emerged, the bird calls faded, and the whole world fell quietly into a deep and peaceful sleep. So there we go. Just over an hour and 11 minutes I have been reading, but I've remedied before the end of 2020 the issue that arose back in the first lockdown that I didn't finish reading this book. You've now had the last 4 chapters, chapters 27, 28, 29 and 30 of the Kraken's Curse, and I really hope you've enjoyed them, and I'll just end this little video by wishing you a very happy new year.